Here she is.
Well, hi, everybody. I am so glad to be here. Thank you, Doug and Anne. And also, I had the great pleasure of having dinner last night with the sponsors, Anne #2 and Bill. And thank you as well. And I also got to visit this amazing bookstore, Horizon, that is supplying the books. You know, I love going on tour, and one of the greatest pleasures is getting to visit new, wonderful bookstores, especially the independent bookstores, which I really support, and I hope you do too. And I gotta tell you, I never know how many people to expect. This is blowing my mind, how many people there are. Right. And when I see this many people, I have to share my favorite author quote of all time, which comes from Margaret Atwood, who said that she thinks that wanting to meet an author because you liked his or her book is like wanting to meet the duck because you liked the pate.
I don't like pate. But we're glad you're here.
Quack, quack.
As Anne said, as she was introducing me, I had a long career as a book editor at Random House, and I left that about 18 months ago to focus on my own writing, and it was only a couple months, and I was an editor for almost 20 years, so I always had on my desk manuscripts that needed to be read, and writers that I needed to get back to, and memos I needed to write, and in the winter of 2016, it was the first time in my life in years, and basically my adult working life, that I didn't have a pile of manuscripts I needed to read, and that was sort of the point of no longer being an editor. But I loved being an editor, and what I loved most about being an editor was reading a manuscript and getting out my pen and thinking. And that's when Julia was finishing this novel. And she asked me to read it after her great editor, Deb Garrison, had read it. And it was such an honor to get to read such a great writer's work early in the process. Or not early, but before it's done. And that she wanted to know what I thought. And I was really touched by that. And so I read it and I loved it. But I had a few notes.
Which is what I was hoping for.
And so with this book, more than any others, we've talked about, and I was there at a crucial point. And one of the things that we talked about was were the characters and how the book was structured around the various characters in the book. And so I thought maybe talking about the book tonight, we would talk about the characters to kind of bring people into what the novel is. And for me, the center of the book, although I wouldn't call him the protagonist, but the center of this book is a man named Mort Lear. And why don't you tell us who he is and how you came to write him?
So Mort Lear is actually dead on page 1 of the book, and I'm not giving away anything, obviously, by telling you that. And let me back up a little and say that unlike any of my previous books, this book was inspired in part by something I read in the newspaper. A couple of years ago, the great, iconic children's book author and illustrator Maurice Sendak died, as many of you know, or maybe all of you know. And there was an article in the New York Times shortly after his death about how the wishes that he expressed in his final will were very different from what all the people around him had expected. For instance, there was a museum in Philadelphia that believed, based on promises made, that most of his work and his memorabilia and his collectibles would go to that museum after his demise. Well, no, they did not get a thing in his will. There were other wishes that were different. But the interesting part to me about this story was that the execution of all these wishes was left in the hands of a long-time, faithful personal assistant who had lived with him in his house for possibly a couple of decades, a woman in her early middle age. And there was a lot of disapproval in the world that who was this woman and how could she possibly know what to do with a great man's literary estate? And she wasn't interviewed in this article, but I thought a lot about her, and I thought, first of all, what would it be like to have devoted the prime years of your adult life to the care and feeding and grooming of a genius? And then what would it be like if he dies and you are left to care for his creative legacy and the world disapproves? What would that be like? So at first and I didn't want to read anything more about this. Unlike David, I didn't have the energy or will or desire to write a biographical novel, because I could have well decided that I wanted to write a biographical novel about Maurice Sendak, and I did not want to do that. So I didn't read more about these people, but I dreamed up my own set of characters. So Mort Lear, at the center of this novel, is very much inspired by Maurice Sendak and has a lot in common with him. In fact, one of the pleasures for me of writing this book was creating a lot of make-believe children's literature of children's books that this Mort Lear wrote. But Tommy, his assistant, who's 55 at the start of this novel, and facing an enormous challenge, was, for me, the initial central character. I think Mort Lear grew out of her. And then do you want me to talk about the other primary characters?
Yeah, well, as Julie said, Mort everyone is circling around Mort. Everyone's there because of Mort, and although he's dead on page 1. But I think it would be, why don't you tell us why this story gets going and after his death, and what's converging?
So there's another outside element that inspired this book, and it comes from a very different place. It comes from my personal life. I have a son who, God bless him, has since middle grade, since 7th or 8th grade, been absolutely passionately determined to become a working actor. And he is now 21 years old. I've seen him in many, many plays. I've seen him direct plays. But one of the ways in which he and I and his father connect is through going to movies and plays together. And he loves to come home and just make sure that his father and I go to practically a movie a day. And I love the movies. I am completely starstruck. I watch the Oscars every year from the first minute of the red carpet right to the bitter end. I'm the last person awake. And there have been years when I've never seen a single movie, and that does not diminish my enjoyment of the whole spectacle. And the next day I read about, which gowns did the Times think were the best and so on. I just love it. So, but now, because of my son, I actually see a lot of these movies. And at the same time that I was reading this story about Maurice Sendak's estate, it was a season of movies in which, and I went with my son to see many of these movies over his Christmas break from freshman year of college, were biopics. Eddie Redmayne was Stephen Hawking. Benedict Cumberbatch was Alan Turing. Timothy Spall was the painter Turner. Bradley Cooper was American Sniper. And then you had Steve Carell and Channing Tatum. I always get the names reversed. In that strange movie Foxcatcher. And I saw partly because my son really wanted to talk about all these performances, I saw a YouTube interview with a number of these actors and listened to them talk about what it means to play a real person, whether that person is long dead, like the painter Turner, or still alive, like Stephen Hawking, or alive when you begin development of the movie, as the sniper, Chris Kyle, was when Bradley Cooper began, and Bradley Cooper had been in touch with him and was going to visit him in Texas, and then he was assassinated on the firing range. And it was interesting hearing Bradley Cooper talk about what it was like to go from expecting that he would meet this man to knowing that he would never meet him and to portray him on screen. And I thought, well, supposing that Mort Lear was being portrayed in a movie, supposing there was a biopic in the works of his early life, and there's a childhood trauma that you find out about in this book that the movie centers on. And so he has corresponded with an actor who cast to play him, who is coming to meet him. and then he dies. And so that actor, whose name is Nicholas Green, is the other major protagonist besides Tommy Dallaire, and the book begins with the line, "Today the actor arrives." And Tommy Dallaire is an introvert and a very serious woman. She has no desire to meet this newly minted movie star who is arriving to interview her about the man she devoted her life to. And so his point of view, as he struggles with things that he knows about this man based on their correspondence and on the burden of playing this man, is another point of view. And then the third major point of view is a museum curator named Meredith Galarza, who is the spurned director who believed, quite logically, that her museum would be the holding place for his work, and now is not. And those three characters and the way they come together are what light the fire under the events in this book.
You once said to me that you saw an actor's job and a fiction writer's job is not so dissimilar. Could you elaborate on that, and also maybe then from there tell us about the character Nicholas Green, the actor who wants to play Mort Lear?
Okay, so years ago, I don't know if anybody reads him anymore, but are you familiar with the work of Patrick White, the Nobel Prize-winning Australian novelist?
I've never read him.
So I was absolutely besotted with him in my 20s. He wrote these huge novels, and he seemed like a major figure to me, but that was many years ago, my 20s. And I read his autobiography, and he said that the reason he became a fiction writer was because he could not become an actor. And I've never forgotten that, because what he was saying is that what the fiction writer does, in fact must do, is create believable, fully dimensional characters. I mean, whether those characters are in starships, in science fiction novels, or they're zombies or vampires, or assistants to children's book authors in my novel, we not only do we have to create them, but we inhabit those characters. So it's kind of like we are playwrights, and then we get to act out all the roles as we write it, which is actually the most fun thing to get to do, is to play all the roles. And I had some fun with the actor Nicholas Green, who I wanted to have be a very benevolent figure, not a bad boy actor, not a narcissistic actor. And one of the other phenomena that I was noticing watching movies with my son is how often I'd go to see a movie and see some actor I didn't know before who seemed very American, and then he'd be interviewed on the Charlie Rose show or something, and he'd be British. What is Tom Hiddleston doing playing Hank Williams? And I thought, hey, you're stealing these roles from all these, I think of my son's future, no British actor better steal a role from him, or I'm gonna have something to say. So I thought, well, wouldn't it be kind of fun, because Mort Lear, like Maurice Sendak, grew up partly in working class Brooklyn, so you can imagine what his voice would sound like. And I thought, well, what if a British actor, very genteel British actor who happened to resemble him, had landed this role? So, and I think I gravitate toward Brits, Fenno MacLeod, this Scottish character in Three Junes. I love all those Britishisms and any excuse to use them. So I created this character, Nicholas Green, and as David knows, I am a big fan of Eddie Redmayne, and I loved him as Stephen Hawking. You better be. Well, of course, if you'd had a son who, no, it's okay. I guess Danish, English, it's okay. And Stephen Hawking was English. So when I found out, being friends with David, and I'll never forget, I didn't find it out from David. Here I was, a big fan of Eddie Redmayne, and read that he had landed the role of the Danish girl, which passed through different hands. It was supposed to be Nicole Kidman and then Charlize Theron, maybe? Or
Charlize was going to play the female lead opposite Nicole.
Oh, yeah. I see. So I just remember sitting bolt upright and immediately going to my email and going, David, So when the movie was underway and David went to visit the set in Copenhagen, I said, can you get me a lock of hair? And he's like, David's very serious. He goes, I don't think so, actually. Maybe an autographed. I mean, I think he was like, maybe I'm gonna put her in my spam filter. No, and I should tell you that one of the reasons I love Eddie Redmayne is not just because he seems like such a gentleman, but I have a son, a 16-year-old, who people constantly remark looks like him.
Very much so, yeah.
So I have what I call a mom crush on Eddie. He's my missing child, and I am old enough to be his mother. So anyway, when I created him, I thought one of the other things I really had fun with was, what is it like to be a movie star and be stalked in the age of social media and the cell phone, where people can just walk up and snap your picture. It's not just people with these giant zoom lenses popping out from behind shrubs. And I had fun creating websites that kind of stalk the actor in question. And Nicholas Green is also someone who has only very recently become a household name. So he is going through kind of a lot of confusion about what his identity is like. Do people, and he has no girlfriend and wonders if he's ever going to have a real love relationship again. And he also has a kind of brassy older actress who is his mentor, who I thought of as a cross between Patti LuPone and Lindsay Lohan. She's someone who's been through rehab a few times, and she's been divorced, but she knows the business, and she is his co-star in the movie that wins him all the awards. I brought my little show and tell. Should I do my?
Definitely.
So I have to say, the same day my book came out, about 10 days ago, a friend's book about the storied bars of New York came out. And I went to her book event in Cambridge, Massachusetts with my husband. And when you go to a book event in the bookstore, I find my eyes, I listen, but my eyes wander to the shelves, whatever shelves they've kind of shoved aside. It's usually where the self-help and the travel guides are, or maybe the children's books. But in this bookstore, I was looking and I saw this section of what are, these adult coloring books, which I have to tell you, I don't really get it. I think it sounds perfectly fine. It's better than buying a gun and practicing at the shooting range. I don't know if I'm talking in an open carry state, so forgive me if I don't mean to make fun of anybody carrying a gun. But
please don't.
So I'm looking. I am looking at this shelf, and I see something that catches my eye, and I say to my husband, "Can you see that book up there? That isn't who I think it is on the cover." Well, it is a book called Color Me Good, Eddie Redmayne. It's an Eddie Redmayne coloring book, and immediately afterwards, I go and I grab this, and because it's not colored in, and his eyes are all white, he looks like he's on some psychedelic drug through the whole, and I'm not going to color him, but there are these things so here he's clutching thin air. Eddie is fast running out of awards to win, so design him a new one. What did he win it for? And so there are all these, this is a good one. Here's a picture. It says, "Isn't he lovely?" And you have three choices. Yes, yes, and yes are the choices. And here he is balancing a teapot on his foot, and you're supposed to draw other objects that he's balancing. But I'm going to show you. This is a good one. Draw yourself looking straight into his eyes. And I'm going to just show you one more because it's really my favorite in here. Here it is. So here you see him clutching very tightly a bottle, and he looks very worried. And there's a glass on this, and it says, "Eddie has heard about the worldwide Prosecco shortage and is being all tight with it. How are you going to persuade him to give you some?" So I'm enjoying carrying this around with me on my tour.
So when Julie emailed me and said, Eddie Redmayne's going to be in The Danish Girl, I love Eddie Redmayne, and I wrote back like, yeah, he's great, and then she wrote me back. She's like, no, you don't understand. I love Eddie Redmayne, and I guess I didn't understand. If only I had that when I went to set. Eddie and I could have sat down and drawn those together. So,
No.
so
But
Nick,
the whole point is celebrity culture is so strange, and I think I mean, as I fully admit, I'm completely starstruck by all the Oscars, et cetera. But and so to write about what it's like to be inside that world
yeah.
was something I
And I
enjoyed.
think I don't know that world, but having maybe just visited it briefly for a nanosecond, I think what you did is you showed an artist, an actor who wants to maintain his integrity and wants to challenge himself. He's young. He's won an Oscar. He's already been catapulted to the top of his profession, and he wants to figure out, how do I maintain my internal life and my artistic ambitions while all this stuff is coming at him, all this kind of coloring book stuff and everything else that could distract many artists. And so it fits into the book's larger theme of art and artists, because Mort Lear, of course, is a genius artist, and it also explains in part why Nicholas Green is drawn to wants to play Mort Lear. Why don't we talk about Tommy a little more?
Yes. So also the contrast between Tommy, who is, as I said, an introverted woman who has been content for 25 years to live alongside and work for the. You can answer it and say you're listening to the brilliant Julia Glass and David Ebershoff. As long as you get them to buy a book, you're forgiven.
20% off tonight.
Yeah, hurry on over. So, what was I saying? Oh, so I imagined what kind of a person would do that, would set aside going out and making a life of their own in order to not just work for, but live alongside, travel with. At one point she talks about all her responsibilities, or she reflects on them. She's a webmaster, she's a travel companion, she's a business assistant. She wore many hats. But of course, someone like that didn't plan. It's not that she started working for him right out of college, and the way in which she started working for him dates back to her having met him somewhat accidentally when she was 12 years old in a playground in Manhattan. And as is typical of my novels, there are many flashbacks. And though you start in the present moment, right after Mort Lear's death, gradually you watch how exactly Tommy struggled with her own desire to have an independent life of her own, and moved away from and back toward Mort Lear, especially when he had a fairly self-destructive relationship with another man. He had a relationship for almost a decade with a younger, very handsome, but very temperamental gay man who moved in. So then the three of them lived in the house together. And another important character in the novel is Tommy Dallair's younger brother, who has a real chip on his shoulder because, in fact, when she was 12 and she was babysitting her younger brother in this playground, this artist came in and wanted to draw her brother, which she was very protective of her brother, but he charmed her. And that man was Mort Lear, and the illustrations that he created from the drawings of her 5-year-old brother became the book that launched him to fame, which is a book called Colorquake, that I actually write almost in its entirety in this book, and that you can certainly see as a parallel to Where the Wild Things Are. So her competing emotions now toward her brother, toward Mort Lear, toward this actor, form really the central tension of the novel, and the choices that she has to make. Also, how is she going to go forward in her life now? She inherits the house and the property, but what is she going to do from now on? So there's kind of a reckoning there.
Do you want to read a touch of the book? I think Julie has such a masterful style, and I think it's wonderful to give you a taste of the language. What are you going to start?
Do you want me just to read the first page?
I think that's a good idea. Yeah.
Okay.
And take us in through
Okay.
Tommy.
I'm just going to read you the first page here. Today, the actor arrives. Awake too early, too nervous for breakfast. Coffee alone makes her more nervous still. Fretful over what to wear, then irritated at caring so much. Tommy patrols the house that is now hers, shockingly and entirely hers. Not just her bedroom and all it contains, but everything she can see from its 2 windows. 7 acres of gardens and grass and quickening fruit trees, fieldstone walls and stacks of wood, shed and garage and hibernating pool. The sky above, does she own that too? Owning the sky would be easy. The sky would be a gift. The sky weighs nothing. The sky is unconditional. She roams and circles through rooms she knows by heart: living room, dining room, kitchen, den, mudroom, pantry, porch. She cannot enter a room these days without beginning a mental inventory. What to keep, what to give away. Worse, far worse, how much of it will she sell? She goes to and from the studio, back and forth between this world and that. In that one, he simply must be alive. So many times that her skirt is now damp from brushing against the tight-fisted buds of the peonies flanking the path. Will she have to change again? The birds are in prime song, the sun beyond a promise, the day upon them all. 5 hours to fill, and Tommy has no idea how.
Thank you. There's a third, as you mentioned earlier, there's a third central figure in the novel, Meredith. Tell us who she is and the role that she's playing and the challenges you face in creating that character.
So actually, you know, Anne Stanton was telling me how much she enjoyed my description of Meredith, who is a woman who kind of nothing's going right for her at this particular moment in her life, even before she finds out the incredibly mortifying, no pun intended, but the mortifying fact that Mort Lear is not, after 15 years of her working closely with him, of the conservator at the museum saving his drawings from oblivion, not going to leave the museum one thing. And I don't know, Anne, I thought you said it was page 59. Maybe I don't know. I was just going to, because you wondered if I might, I'll just see if I can see that description here, but I can't see it right now. But anyway, she's a certain kind of woman that if you live in Manhattan or any big city is familiar to everybody. She is incredibly successful in her career. She is an art historian who has become the curator, the director of a museum that I made up, which is the Museum of the Contemporary Book, which I have located in Long Island City, Queens, but it's going to move to a new building that's being created on the banks of the Gowanus Canal in Brooklyn, which is now, as everybody knows, the absolute hub of cool in the world.
And the Gowanus Canal for 100 years was a toxic cesspool.
A cesspool. I mean,
industrial
I lived
waste.
3 blocks from the Gowanus Canal from 1980 to 1986 when it was not cool to live in Brooklyn. So I remember what it smelled like back then. So you know, I had fun playing with all these kind of the tropes of Manhattan and Brooklyn and how New York City has changed and become cooler and more expensive than ever. But so here she is, you know, at the pinnacle of her career, and the thing she's planned for this new iteration of the museum is that there will be a wing devoted just to the work of Mort Lear, and she was planning this with him. But she's made this decision also, partly because the board of directors have, to add in the work of a very hip graphic novelist, someone who is tattooed from head to foot, and whose work and person Mort Lear despises above all things, as you discover through Tommy's memories of that. And one of the things that I deal with here is also creative and professional jealousies that I think arrive inevitably. It's very hard when you're successful. I mean, on the one hand, like, I feel like I love to help out younger artists, but sometimes I have these moments of insecurity where I feel like there are novelists who are my contemporaries who are, you know, passing me, overshadowing me, and I can and Hagen feels kind of resentful, and I channeled a little bit of that too. But at the same time that Meredith Galarza is doing so well in her career, her marriage has fallen apart. She's newly divorced. She and her husband tried very hard to have a child and couldn't. And I think, as she puts it, her marriage was wrecked on the shoals of infertility angst, something like that. And I'm very empathic toward this character, and not only is she now newly alone, living with her dog, who she loves, and I always seem to have dogs in my books, but her rent on her fabulous apartment is about to shoot through the roof because there's a threshold in New York where your rent-stabilized apartment suddenly can be jacked up to market value if you. It's complicated, but I knew people who went through that. So she doesn't know where she's going to be living. She's lonely. She talks to her dog too much, and now her career is possibly in jeopardy as well. So, my initial version of her, and when David read the manuscript, it's interesting. When David read the manuscript, there was a fourth point of view, and that was the point of view of Danny, the embittered younger brother of Tommy. And what's interesting is that my editor and agent, who are both incredible readers, and without whom I just could not make the books I make, they did think that Danny's point of view was the weakest, but they felt that it was fine and it was justified. But David, and I don't think you even advised this per se, but David led me to the conclusion that I could eliminate Danny's point of view. And it was tough because there were things I needed the reader to know that I had to let the reader know in other ways. But I could do that. But also you felt that Mary was maybe a little too not three-dimensional enough. And so by cutting away one point of view, that allowed me to it gave me more space to enrich, I hope, Mary's character. I mean, she's the third wheel perhaps, but I'm very grateful because there's a point beyond which you can't just keep making a book longer and longer. I think every book has its appropriate length. I'm a big overwriter, so I always have to cut.
Same.
But this allowed me to do the cutting necessary to add more for that character, and that's a great contribution that you made to the book.
I thought that because there's a lot of thinking about art and creating art and what an artist goes through to get to what Mort Lear goes through to get to a book that becomes a phenomenon and that generations read. I felt that there's a sort of a beautiful structure of having Mort as this gravitational pole in the center and three people around, and the fourth seemed to an imbalance, like too much was gonna be around it, and I thought it just the threes are always an elegant grouping, and so artistically it seemed to make sense, but you can't do there have to also be there's plot things to consider, as you said, but I also I think you made the right decision. If
he may say so himself.
But you came to that conclusion on your own. I mean, we were just talking about why that point of view was not as significant, and ultimately, I think I felt that what he goes through, his great personal struggle is that he has been rendered by an artist without really giving his own permission, and himself being rendered as this young child now lives on and on and on in this in a book as well known as something like Where the Wild Things Are, and so generations of children are seeing a version of him, and he feels like that's been taken from him, right?
And he's just become a father also.
Right, that's right, and there's that too. And that's a really interesting question, but it seemed to me that you could get at that question through the others, and in some ways you could open it up in different ways. Let's this is a good point to talk about the children's books and children's literature and what children's literature means to you or meant to you as a child, and then also how cool it was to create an oeuvre of an author, a bookshelf of an author's work. Mort Lear has a significant backlist, all created by Julia Glass, and they also have great titles. And so let's talk about that.
Well, also, what's funny about the title issue is I struggle very, very hard to title my books. As David said earlier, this book really didn't have a title when he read the manuscript, and I was once again going through all kinds of titles, and I sort of whined in an email, you know, I can't title books. I don't. And David said to me, well, Mort Lear did a pretty good job. Why don't you just ask him to title the book for you? And it's true.
Give us some of the other titles.
So, well, Cloudquake is his iconic book with this little boy named Evo, and there's a reference to how many little boys have been named Evo as a result of this. But there's another picture book called Rumple Crumple Engine Foot. That is, and I imagine this whole thing, you know, I can just see it in my head, where you see underneath a table, you see a grown-up's shoes, and there's a father, there's a child playing under a table, and the father is trying to write something, and he keeps throwing these crumpled pieces of paper down, and the child holds each one up to the window, and it resembles something the way a cloud might, and he's making his own story based on those shapes of those crumpled pieces of paper under the, and then there's a book, one of his very earliest books is called The Boy Who Was Afraid of Being Afraid. And there are some other books.
The trilogy.
And then the trilogy. So unlike Maurice Sendak, in his later career, he writes a trilogy of young adult novels. And all together they are called The Inseparables, this trilogy. And that was going to be the title of the book. I won't go into why it's not. But it's about three children who grow up together in this little suburban street, and they do everything together. Their names are, I think, Greta, Boris, and Stinky. And they, when they're in high school, they are all diagnosed simultaneously with a disease. Now, Mort plays with, is it cancer? Is it something else? But they all go into treatment together. They decide that they are going to be treated for their, let's just say, cancer together. And while they are together in the radiation unit, and you know, I've been through cancer experiences, so cancer comes in and out of my novels. And one of the things I remembered is being told when I was having radiation, how the radiation unit is really sealed in lead, the whole thing, so that if there should be any leakage, only the people in that area will be irradiated. So, but we're all being irradiated anyway. So some kind of cataclysmic thing happens out in the world, and the three of them are the only people who are not affected. So they go forth and they save the world through this trilogy, and they have a dog named Mucho. And the first book is called Diagnosis, and the second book is called Metastasis, and the third book is called Remission. And he writes these books while this difficult lover of his is diagnosed with and dying of AIDS. And I'm not giving away a lot there. But, you know, and I don't know if we spoke about this when we did our warm-up event in New York, because we were together in New York for an event. But I wondered, after I finished this book, people who know my books know that the plague years in New York, what we call them, the time of the terrible scourge of deaths from HIV in New York is something that comes again and again into my books. And I wonder why that was. And I lived in the West Village during the worst of those years. I did volunteer work with an organization that helped people with HIV actually take care of their pets, because a lot of people had to give up their pets if they didn't get assistance of one kind or another. And I was recently listening to my mother, who's in her mid-80s, brag yet again about how she's a member of the greatest generation, because, and maybe many of you are, and maybe you are the greatest generation, because she could remember being a child in the Depression and then growing, living through World War II, seeing her older siblings, her older brothers go enlist, and then her older siblings, her friends, some of them die, not come home from war. And I realized that the plague years are my war. I was a witness to the war. I wasn't a combatant in the war, perhaps, but I think that those years for me made such a traumatic mark on me that they will come into my work again and again without my being able to help that. And it makes me think about how our lives as writers intersect with history.
It's a really moving part of the book, and this man who has AIDS is a difficult man. He's a tough guy to love, and you challenge the reader to feel empathy for him as he's going through this horrible demise, because he's bitter. And yet, one of the things I love when I read fiction where I find myself rooting for somebody that I probably really would dislike in person, and that's a sign of a great writer, because you've gotten us into their point of view. You can see how they see the world. You can understand their disappointments and their pain. And this man bears a lot of pain, and so as he's dying, even though he's been so unpleasant to Mort, the guy that we really, really admire and love, we still feel we're with him on that in those final years of his life. I want to maybe shift from that to the top, since we were talking about book titles, and we heard these great book titles of Mort Lear's backlist. And don't those titles sound like you could go to Horizon Books and buy them? Like Color Quake, The Inseparables. Somebody's going to ask
I really
for
appreciate the extra royalties, too.
And you went through different titles for the novel. And then you settled on House Among the Trees. So I wanted to talk about House, and this house, and what it means to these characters, and maybe you could go bigger from that in House and Houses.
Well, first of all, I love shelter porn. I bet you do too, right? Do you know what shelter porn is? It's like architectural magazines and pictures of beautiful homes that you're never going to be able to afford. And and the dreams from which I wake up all hot and sweaty are dreams of houses I would love to live in. And in fact, I had one last night. It was a fixer-upper, the kind of thing that everybody would talk you down from buying. But it had this amazing wallpaper. This is my dream last night. Do you know what toile is? It's that sort of French, it's like there are stories being told. It's all in one color. This house had this toile wallpaper that was green on ivory that depicted the building of tree houses. Wow. People in trees building tree houses. And I'm sad to say that I just realized I've lost the imagery, because when I woke up this morning, I could just see it so vividly. Thank you, Cordia. I'm sure there's something about staying at Cordia that inspired this crazy wallpaper. So I was a painter for, I didn't hear all of Anne's introduction, and she may have mentioned that I majored in art in college. I was a painter through my 20s, and I really didn't start writing fiction until my early 30s. And making that change was very challenging for me and painful in many ways, because I thought, oh my goodness, I've wasted a decade of my life. I should have been writing fiction. What I didn't realize is that those years of looking at the world so attentively and visually have made me the writer I am. And the greatest pleasure for me when I'm starting in on a novel or any story is to put the reader in a place. And because of my love of houses, to create houses, there's always some very particular house in my books. And so once I kind of knew who these characters were going to be, and I knew that most of the action in this book would take place in this house, I pictured, first it was a clapboard house, then it became a brick house, and I sort of pictured something kind of out of a Beatrix Potter book. But that title A House Among the Trees. So my editor and I were struggling I was trying to use the characters' names. I thought, oh, Morty and Tommy. No, Tommy and Nick. And then I thought, I wished I'd had better names. And then I started, and this really, I had to be sort of slapped down from this. I was going to use girl in the title. I think, there's so many. I had the storyteller's girl, the storyteller's apprentice, and someone said, just do not, there's all these girl books, Girl on a Train, Girl with a Dragon Tattoo. I think somehow that I was talked down from that very fast. And then I thought, well, let me think about this place that I've created, because this place is so important to the book. Morty chose to leave New York City because he wanted a property with really beautiful trees. At one point, Tommy remembers his showing her the property, and he bought it for these beautiful old trees all over the property, and you kind of get a tour of those trees. I love trees. And so I thought, oh, I'll just call it A House Among the Trees. And I didn't realize that the first line of his iconic book, Colorquake, which, as I told you, I almost wrote in its entirety within the book. It's a picture book. The first line of that book, which I had already written, was Evo's mother kept a perfect house, a house among the trees. But I didn't even remember that came. And my editor said, oh, that's a perfect title. It comes right out of Evo's book. And I said, it does? and it did. So magic things happen like that.
I told you to go to Mort Lear. And so that was meant to be. I think we should open it up now to the questions from the audience.
Thank you, David. I really enjoyed being with you on stage here.
We're not
I'm
done.
still enjoying
We're not
it.
done.
We're not done.
We're not done.
But those
We're
are
not
great
done.
questions. Good questions.
I believe there are microphones on both sides, and if you wait till you get the microphone, and that first one is always hard, oh, no, we have a brave soul. Okay, thank you.
You talked about Hollywood and how much you love all that. Both of you have had books made into movies.
Not me.
No, the house at the end
Yet.
of the. Yes.
No.
No.
No, none of my books have even been optioned. If there are any
Wait,
producers
wait,
out
wait.
there.
Then, really?
Really? If you know, if they made a movie and they didn't tell me, they're in trouble. So,
God, Colin Farrell, I see this book, and I'm like, I thought
bring it
Look,
on.
I apologize. Okay, you've had dealings with Hollywood, so I'm just wondering what your experience was. And nobody's wanted to make any of your books?
Why don't you answer that, Julie?
Okay, so there you are, the brave soul.
3 Junes, because it won the National Book Award, did get some attention from people involved in the movies, but it did. There were nibbles, but nobody took the bait. And one of my speculations about that is that if you've read 3 Junes, you know that it takes place in many different locales, among them a Greek island, and you could shoot a lot of the book, whether it's Scotland or New York or Long Island, in Canada, but you can't shoot a Greek island in Canada. And that's one of my theories. I think that and I did have a small meeting with a producer about my second novel, The Whole World Over, which was exciting, but nothing came of that. And then I was told that Nicole Kidman read my third book, I See You Everywhere, which is about 2 grown sisters, but that she decided it was just too sad. I mean, who knows whether that's even true. But what I dream of, and I don't know if this ever really happens, though I've been told it can, is a smart actor reads one of my books and wants to play the role. And I think that's, as far as I know, that's one of the only ways in which a literary novel that doesn't involve terrorism or zombies or vampires has a chance. And it has to be an actor with clout. I happen to know that 3 Junes is one of Laura Linney's favorite books of all time, through several sources. She said so in Oprah Magazine, and then somebody told me that Laura Linney gives copies of 3 Junes to people. So that's wonderful, but unfortunately, I don't think that Laura Linney can play Fano McLeod, so...
For me, with the Danish Girl, it wasn't an actor. It was, and I agree with you that that is very typical. A actor with clout or a director with clout, it becomes their passion project. For me, I wrote The Danish Girl when it came out in 2000, and it came out in 2000. It was my first book, and immediately a wonderful producer in Hollywood named Gail Mutrix optioned the book, and I spoke with Gail, and so when you hear the term, the two words Hollywood producer, I imagine a certain kind of image comes to your mind, probably male, perhaps loud, perhaps a little vulgar. That's what everything about that is not Gail, my producer. Gail is a very sensitive, soft-spoken woman, and she is honest and decent and loves good writing and art, and it was all of those qualities that made her a natural fit for The Danish Girl, but also it was all those qualities that actually got the movie made, because other people with similar qualities wanted to work with her. And I was so lucky that she read the book. It took her 15 years to make it, and that's an extreme period of time. And she kept pushing that boulder up the hill, but she never gave up. And Nicole Kidman was attached for a while as well. But I think my experience was a dream experience, and not typical of what writers end up experiencing. I remember when the deal came through for the film rights, my film agent said, you know, first of all, before the deal, he's like, first of all, most books don't get film deals at all, and then only a small fraction get a film deal, and then only a teeny fraction of those deals, teeny, get made, and then only a micro fraction of those will be something that the author is happy with.
Because you were not happy with the 19th wife, right? Or maybe I shouldn't bring up a sore subject.
This is just on audio. Well, anyway.
Sorry.
But so I lucked out, because a great producer, great director, great actors, and they did their best to make a
Beautiful cinematography,
beautiful
too.
cinematography, and
Everything, music, everything.
and so the lesson I learned was it goes back to the people. The people involved are going to determine a lot about what happens, but it's a very hard experience.
No, and in fact, I have to say one funny thing. When David read my manuscript, there was a reference to clammy-handed producers, and David wrote and said, you know, not all producers are clammy-handed. And I knew you were thinking of Gail, and so I don't know if you read it in the finished version, but I moved clammy-handed. There are clammy-handed handlers. And so the producers are besuited or something like that. But just for you, I took away.
For Gail.
Yeah, that was for Gail.
So we have over here.
Hi. I'm wondering, are any of your books on audio? And if so, are you the reader?
Audiobooks. There are audiobooks of all of my novels. They come out the same day as the hardcover, so I can tell you that if you are an audiobook listener, there is already an audiobook version of this one. I have been very pleased with most of my audiobooks, and sometimes fans come to me and that they love my books, and that's the only way they've experienced them, which I find interesting. I will tell you that after my first two book tours, for my first two books, I often had people say to me, you read so beautifully, how come you didn't do the audiobook? And I got kind of a swelled head. So my third book, I See You Everywhere, told alternate points of view of two grown sisters. I thought, now's my chance. So I told my publisher I could do this, and they decided that they were going to do two actresses. So they said, well, you know, it's really hard work. And they said, we would need you to send us a recording. So I actually made a little cassette tape. They laughed. They had a really hard time at Random House finding anything to play this cassette tape on. I'm a very low-tech person. So, and I read some different scenes, and then they said, you know, we can work with you if you want to come. But you have to understand that this takes a lot of stamina. And sometimes we've had authors think they could do this, And they left the booth after 2 hours, leaving us with no. So I thought, I can do this. And the other actress was the actress Mary Stuart Masterson, whom I know. I actually, and we had become friendly. And so she gave me some great tips. She told me the pharmacy in the village to go to buy all these special sprays and lozenges that actors take, singers, that tasted like, like motor oil, but you just, and only warm water, and et cetera, et cetera. I could go into the story in depth, but I will tell you that after an hour in the sound booth, I thought I would burst into tears. I did it. I did the whole thing. I wish I could redo the first chapter. I did. I have enormous reverence for people who can do this kind of work. It's not at all like reading a book at a reading. And one of the funny things is that the sound is so sensitive, and you're in this booth, and you can't, the sound guy who's like Jack Black, that dude on the machine is there, and then there's a director, and you can hear their voices. But at some point before lunch, your stomach starts to make noises, and they'll say over the PA system, stomach. Or they'll say, if your tongue hits the tongue. And then you have to go back to the beginning of the sentence and start again. And then you break for lunch, and you have lunch, and you don't have dairy, and you don't have beans, and you don't have all this stuff. But you go back, and you're digesting again, and once again, it's stomach, tongue. And then at one point they said, are you rubbing your hands on your trousers? Like, I was going like this. It was like, so to sit there absolutely still. So it's really hard. And I'm glad I did it, but boy, I would never do it again. So I'm grateful to the actors, but I have to tell you that Mary Stuart Masterson, at my request, once again has done the audio for this book, and it's really beautiful, and I'm incredibly happy. I'm also thrilled that my publisher listened to me on that recommendation. And so yes, I am very pleased at the audio productions of my books.
Over here.
Hi. Thanks for coming. We spoke before, but so everyone knows, I'm about halfway through the book. It's absolutely fabulous. I'm in love with the characters. I can't wait to find out what else is going to happen next. But my question for you is really more about process. I'm curious. I love the voice that you give in the different characters and the development that you're sharing with us as we progress through the story. In how you write, can you talk a little bit about how you develop your characters? Do you focus on one person, or do you jump between them as different ideas come up? I'm just curious about your process.
I work from the beginning to the end of a book, and I go very slowly. There are writers who write a really fast draft, and then a slightly slower draft, and then another draft, and they write draft after draft after draft. I go forward in a tortoise-like fashion, partly because I'm very obsessed with language, and that sentence 3 sentences ago, I can't leave it behind if it isn't just the way I want it. So I go forward, back, forward, back, forward, back. And I get to the end of the book, and it's really going to be about a year before I even make it to the first time I look at that last chapter. And I don't plot in advance. I like to think that by about a third of the way through, I have a sense of what the ending will be, but I may change my mind to some degree. And the characters, I have to work on them all simultaneously because, their relationships and the choices they make based on their interactions are what propel the plot forward. So there wouldn't be a way that I could, write one character and then write another character. I mean, another writer might do it that way. And likewise, when I move back and forth in time, that happens completely organically. I don't write the past and the present and then cut them up and paste them together. And one thing that happened in this book that I didn't consciously realize till the end is there are a couple of chapters that are fully flashbacks where you actually see the year. And the first one is Tommy's flashback to the year she was 12 when she met Mort Lear in that playground in New York. And then later there is a similar chapter about a very important encounter in the actor Nicholas Green's childhood. And what I didn't realize until the end of the book really was that he was 12 also. And I thought that was really interesting. And I thought a lot about what did it, and my, being age 12 was a very important year for me. I didn't have any encounters like as they did, but it made me think a lot about what it means to be 12. And it must, and that kind of thing happens unconsciously. So,
How old was your youngest son when you were writing this?
well, that's a really good question. So Oliver, who's now 16, was 13 or so. But I know that 12, then I began to think about 12 in my own children's lives. And 12 is probably when my older son fell in love with Shakespeare and acting. And so I don't know. And I began to ask my friends, do you remember anything about age 12? And I thought suddenly I had this idea, I want to write a book called 12 and just interview a bunch of people about what their life was like when they were 12. So who knows?
One right here.
You talked about titles and the importance of titles. It seems to me as a reader that now it's critically important that you have a compelling book cover. Can you both talk about how much input you are allowed as a writer in what that cover looks like?
Well, actually, David will also be able to speak about how the editor of a book acts as a go-between. Perhaps you do the way Deb has for me, between author and art director. Because there are many authors who certainly feel like this is not my job, I am not. But somehow, since the beginning, I've been allowed, I think, more say in approval of, not genesis of, jacket images. Although I did find the photograph they used on the jacket of my last book, because I had said no to 4 different images, and I thought if I keep saying no, then I better come up with something else, and they used what I came up with. But this, I love this jacket. It's my first white jacket. I've mostly had very blue-green jackets, and these images, there's a paint box, a paintbrush, a pencil, and a mason jar of brushes. Each of those is a stock photograph for which the publisher has paid some money to use. And the type, the type of paper, the typography, they're at least kind enough to say, what do you think of this? And then maybe I might have a little bit of choice, but I don't, there are hills you want to die on and then hills you don't want to die on. And so I try to be as cooperative as I can. I'm kind of a control freak, and my editor is the most tactful, nice person in the world. But what's it like for you as an author? And also, did you have any experiences as editors where authors had fits about jackets? Or?
Well, it was with when the Danish Girl, it was, as I said, it was my first book, and I worked at Random House at the time, but I was still quite junior, and I didn't know it the way I knew it, obviously, at the end of my career. And my publisher, I was just thinking about this. My publisher sent me a jacket that I really didn't like, and it's gray, and there's sort of a hidden face in there, but it's blurry. And it seemed kind of sci-fi to me, and the sort of gray in a metallic way, and I really didn't like it. I thought it was ugly, and I also thought it was not the story. The story is of a transgender woman coming into clarity of who she is and who she wants to be. And my agent, who was a really great agent, she said, she's basically said what you said. She said, the publisher feels very strongly about this, and we're not bursting with ideas, and I think we should, I think you should go with it. She didn't tell me to, and I sort of said, yeah, okay. And I never liked that hardcover cover. Well, that hardcover cover came and went. I mean, the book did okay in hardcover, but wasn't a bestseller in any sense. And all my foreign publishers used a different cover, and then when they released it in paperback the following year, they used a different cover, and so that image just like it went away. And then okay, there's no way to say this without sort of like tooting my own, but this weekend the New York Times did they did a piece on LGBT literature in the last 20 years. 25 books. They said 25 books of LGBT literature of the last 20 years. And they included the Danish Girl in that, and they showed that original jacket, which I hadn't seen in a long time. And they went back to the original covers of the books that they were showing. And I still feel like that's the wrong jacket. And to me, nothing beats what I currently have, which is Eddie Redmayne as Lily and Alicia Vikander as Gerda or Greta, and they embody those characters, and that cover shows what this story is about, and it shows the love that is in that book, and I love where we've ended up.
I was just curious, every character in the book has a mother that dies. And there are very strong pulls with those mothers' deaths. And I'm just curious why that is. I mean, it dies in 3 Junes, the mother dies. It's just a very strong statement, I think.
So are you talking about 3 Junes?
No,
or
I'm
this?
talking about this
Okay.
book. I mean, Tommy's mother dies. You know, Mort's
Right.
mother dies, Nick's mother
Yes.
dies, everybody dies.
Right. Well, you're right, and I'm not saying anything about my desire to kill off mothers. But yes, no, I made a conscious decision in this case that the way I had to find a way in which Tommy and this actor who arrives, and they have this incredibly awkward encounter in this house. Both of them are very self-conscious for different reasons. You know, one thing that I sort of played with their encounter, and I think you weren't entirely happy with the way I did their initial encounter, and I'm not sure I changed it quite enough, but I lived in New York City for a long time before I lived in Massachusetts, and I lived in a neighborhood where a number of movie stars lived. And I'll never forget the day that my older son, who was, I think, 4 or 5, we were walking down the street, and he saw a dog. There were 2 people talking, and there was a dog on a leash. And he said, you know, he wanted to pet the dog. And so I went to ask the person who had the dog on the leash, can my son pet your dog? It was Gwyneth Paltrow. And I could not believe how beautiful she was. I mean, I was closer than I am to you. She was just some kind of superhuman creature. You know, you always think, the camera, you know, that's all airbrushed. They don't really look like that. And so when Tommy greets the actor at the door, this guy she's seen on the CVS racks, as she says, and, you know, it's like another species in a way, that beauty, that incredible, you know, what makes a star, a beautiful person, a star. There's a certain something. So there was that. And then he, of course, feels like he's invading this space. He was supposed to come and meet Mort. Mort is not alive. And I thought, how am I going to have them connect in some way? And I already knew Tommy's parental story. Her parents are very benevolent figures in here. They're very loving parents. They're kind of bohemians. The dad loves to compose silly folk songs. I don't know if any of you know Tom Lehrer. I grew up hearing that stuff, so he's kind of like a Tom Lehrer type. And that's when I decided that his mother would also have died. And then, of course, that grew into the plot that his mother had died in this tragic way. And it turns out that their mothers both died of breast cancer. And although Tommy is reluctant to really talk about that, it's a way in which they do kind of bond. And sometimes when I make those kind of deliberate plot choices, I worry whether it seems too manipulated, but that's part of why the dead moms loom a little large there. And Mort Lear's mother hangs on for a long time. She does. And her death is an important turning point and she has Alzheimer's, but she does not die tragically young. I think also as I get older and I and my friends are losing our parents, seeing parents age and die, is in my books more than it was when I was younger because it's in my life more.
We have time for 1 or 2 more questions.
Welcome back, David, and thanks for being
Thank
part
you.
of our Pride Week this week in Traverse City.
Represent.
Yay. Julia, welcome from Michigan Writers. We're really glad you're here. We have a lot of people in the audience that are fiction writers. What's your latest advice for folks?
Advice. Well, read. You know, the best teachers are the writers. And as I tell my fiction students, you know, it's good to read contemporary fiction, but at some point, you want to compete, right? You know, the competitive spirit can be quite healthy. It's nice to be companionable with our fellow writers, but I said, but when you choose who to compete with, it's always better to choose the dead authors because nobody can be really jealous of anybody who's dead. So I think reading is the number one thing. And you know, I hate to say this because it sounds so cliche, but persevere. You know, there is so much discouraging talk, even among published writers, about the state of publishing, the state of reading, who's reading, everybody's watching TV, they're watching these amazing new TV series, and it's true that there is some astonishing high-quality storytelling going on through the screen. I fully admit that. I have been pulled in. I didn't used to be a TV watcher at all, but now I do watch a few series. But as Anne said, you know, when my first book won the National Book Award, to people who don't know what goes into being a writer, it looked like, you know, I just descended from outer space on some pod, and there I was, 46 years old. You know, that book took years and years to write. As I said, I started writing fiction seriously in my early 30s, and I started submitting kind of right away, naively, grandiosely, whatever. It took me 7 years of having my stories rejected to have my first story published, and it was not in the New Yorker. I was a runner-up for a creative writing prize that the Chicago Tribune had, but my story was published as a runner-up. And from there, it was another 7 years until 3 Junes was published. So that's 14 years. 14 years of seriously attempting to write. And as Anne said, you know, my view is that anybody really sane would have quit. So, you know, you can take that story however you want, but it doesn't happen overnight. It may appear for some people to happen overnight. And yes, there are people who go to creative writing programs and have their first novel published when they're 25, but that's really not the norm. There's a lot of focus on that because we live in a very youth-oriented culture, but a lot of people see their first work or even just their best work published when they're older. And I'm happy to be a standard bearer for that.
I would add definitely read a lot and write a lot. And the other piece of advice I give my students is find a good story and tell it well. And you may find that story within, you may find that story outside of yourself, or it probably be some mix of those two. But starting with a great story is a great help, and then you can tell it in a way that no one else can, and that's what telling it well means. Tell it your way, the way you see it, and the way it resonates with you. And then briefly on this, what Julie was saying about people lamenting the state of book publishing, I used to, whenever people said that, when I was an editor, I had no time for that. And my joke was, publishers and writers have been complaining about the state of book publishing since Gutenberg. We have one more question. There was one up here. And then, yeah.
My question is, your characters, how, and I haven't read the new one, but first of all, I think A Widower's Tale is ready for
Great
movies.
book.
It should be a motion picture. I mean, it really should be. But he and many of your other male characters, who was he?
So the question is about The Widower's Tale. And
Oh, I love that book.
I have to tell you, David wrote me the most beautiful fan email about The Widower's Tale. We were already friends, and I have read that letter at reading, when I did readings for The Widower's Tale, and people were like, oh, and David, at the end of the book of The Widower's Tale, the widower he's a swimmer, He's 70, I think 3 at the end of the book, and he has to move houses, and he moves to a town based on the town where I live, which is Marblehead, Massachusetts, and he swims across the harbor, a small harbor, and you wrote something like, I see him now swimming across that harbor. You just kind of made me cry at my own image of this guy swimming. And you said something about the book showing life in its, I wish I could remember, David, in its like fullness, its difficulty, its heartbreak, its whatever. And then you said, he is my hero. And I thought, wow, he was the hero of the book. And I think when we read great stories, we're looking for heroes. But they're not going to be perfect. They're not going to be superheroes. They are heroes of the heart, or they are heroes because they endure something that could seem unbearable, whether it's, the loss of a loved one, or it's stage 4 cancer, or it's, whatever it is. The best fiction is all about how human beings endure, how we're resilient, how we adapt. And as far as that character goes, he emerged from within me. So Percy Darling, the widower, is actually my inner curmudgeon. And I had occasion to move for 1 year to the town I grew up in. And I'd visited that town for all the holidays because my mother still lived there, still lives there now. But I hadn't noticed till I lived there how things had changed sort of behind the scenes. And one night I was walking out after a really big snowstorm when there's no cars, and I saw some house that I remembered as a child. It was this really old colonial house. But you could see at night that they had gutted the kitchen, and it looked all kind of modern inside. And I thought, how could they have done that to that house? And I found myself just constantly like, who gave them permission to change that? And who, and I had to buy a new computer, and I hated the new computer, and I thought, wow, I'm not even, I think I wasn't even 50 yet, and I thought, I am way too young to have this kind of an attitude. And that was when this character, Percy Darling, came to me. He's someone who, at age 72, looks around him and he's like, how can they be changing all this stuff? But he himself is confronted in very unexpected ways with change that he has to face. And it has to do with trying to kind of save one of his daughters who's really going off the rails. And I will say this, even though he's really a piece of me, as many of my characters are, I wanted very hard to try to capture my father's sense of humor. My father was this very scholarly man. He was still alive when I wrote that book. Very scholarly man with an incredibly dry sense of humor. And he loved language. And for instance, when my sister and I were, teenagers and going around, and I remember that we would call everything, oh, that's so gross, that's so gross. And he'd say, you really need to broaden your vocabulary. You could, for instance, gross, you could say 12 dozen. And he said, or you could say untoward. He said, and perhaps you could say an anti-directional, being untoward, being anti-directional. He also, or we might say somebody is, oh God, he's such a jerk. He'd say jerk, that's not a very interesting insult. And my favorite insult, he would give us these insults. He said, why not call him a geophagic troglodyte? Which means dirt-eating cave dweller. And I'll just tell one little story, which is that living in the West Village, my now husband and I were living in a ground floor apartment at the end of the hall, and we had the Sunday Times delivered at the base of our door every Sunday. Well, all of a sudden, somebody started stealing that paper. I'd open the door, and every Sunday morning it would be gone, and I was really upset about that. And I, didn't really know how to handle it, and I said, I'm putting a sign out there. And I said, and I put this piece of paper in Sharpie, I wrote, and I put it down low on the door. I said, I can't remember exactly what I said, but it was something like, you geophagic troglodyte, stop stealing my paper. And my paper was never stolen again. I'm sure they were terrified of what kind of a maniac lived behind that door.
Julia, thank you so much. It was great to be with
David.
you tonight. Julia's going to sign books. And, all right.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you, David, for see you in the lobby, and have a great summer. Bye-bye.